James is going to join us first and walk us through the amendment. And then I also asked the fiscal office if they have time and can say anything that might be relevant. And then if we have more time, and we can switch the order around too here, Lenore Horton is here from Hunger Free Vermont and may have information that might be useful too. And then before we leave at 3, please don't let me forget, we need to have a straw poll. And Representative Cole then will be presenting tomorrow, I imagine. We'll get an update on that. And we'll report that number. So good. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Beth St. James, Office of Legislative Counsel. I'm just going to share my screen. This is the Senate proposal of amendment. Yes. That's not what
we need 18-point type here.
There we go. How's that?
That's much better.
Okay. So what the Senate is proposing to you all is to make no other changes to the bill. However, to add an appropriation back in. So you'll remember that the bill is introduced, included an appropriation. It was removed in the House process, and now the Senate has added it back in without making any other changes to the bill. So they're adding it in as a new section 3A, which would fit right after all the universal meals language and right before the local foods incentive programs, right in the middle of the bill. The sum of $29 million is appropriated from the Education Fund to the Agency of Education for fiscal year 2024 to provide reimbursement for school meals under 16 VSA 4017, which is the new statute that H165 creates with the universal meals supplement reimbursement language. Going forward, this would be treated as, if this passes and becomes law, it would be treated like categorical aid, right? It would come off the top of the ed fund, so you wouldn't have to see a policy appropriation every year. But to kick us off, to get the program started, we would need to add it somewhere. And so the Senate is proposing to put it back into H165.
Questions? Thank you, Beth. Yes, Representative Graham.
Can you just remind us what the ed funds inputs are?
Oh, what constitutes the ed fund? Like what makes up
property
the ed fund?
taxes?
It's property tax, sales and use tax. Boy, this is a good quiz. It is. Tell you everything.
Lottery.
The education fund is comprised of all revenue paid to the state from statewide education tax on non-homestead and homestead property, revenues from state lottery and any multi-jurisdictional lottery game authorized under that chapter in Title 31, 25% of the revenues from the meals and rooms taxes, 1/3 of the revenues raised from the purchase and use tax, revenues raised from sales and use tax, and these are different taxes that are all codified in the in Title 32, which is the tax title, and Medicaid reimbursement funds. And that's it. That's the education fund.
Representative O'Brien.
So Beth, when a hole is created like this didn't exist last year with this type of appropriation. This is maybe more for appropriations, but how over those sources you just mentioned does it get spread out, or did they say specifically we're going to get property tax?
No, this is just an appropriation from the education fund. So it would, the term that everyone throws around that I know my colleagues in JFO do not like, is it comes off the top of the ed fund. So there's a pot of money and there are certain chunks of programming like flexible pathways, special education funding, transportation reimbursement, now universal meals, that they would just take those buckets of money off the top of the ed fund. And then the bulk of what's coming out of the ed fund is everyone's school budgets. No, this appropriation, nor does any of H165 specify that a specific pot of money in the ed fund is used for universal meals.
And we can have JFO tell us a little bit more about the implications then. Representative Templeman?
I'm just trying to remember, is this the original amount of money that we were asking? Okay, great. Thank you.
Representative Lipsky, did you have a hand up?
Where folks that don't support this bill say, well, it ultimately comes from property taxes, that the Vermont property taxpayers are going to be paying 29 million more because of this. Would it be more palatable? Well, that's a policy or political question, but in what you're implying is there's so many other sources of revenue for the ed fund that it's possible that none of this is coming from property tax. Or a portion of it might be. Is it 50% or is there any way to?
I'm going to refer to my colleague in JFO. The bulk of the ed fund comes from property taxes.
Like 95% of it?
I would have to look
98%.
that up, and to do that, I would have to look up materials that Julia has prepared. So I am going to respectfully suggest that you ask
All right.
Julia.
We should stay on track. It
We'll-
was important to our committee, initiative.
Yeah, no, I think it's an important question, and we'll switch over in a moment to JFO, but other questions. And this might not be a question best directed at you either, but if the bill hadn't been amended this way, the alternative, an alternative would have been to put the $29 million in the budget. That's the way the House budget, I think.
Correct.
Right, went through because we didn't have it here. And there again, there may be political or practical implications, but from a legal standpoint, it could have happened either way.
Correct.
Yeah, okay.
How does it work with, if so it's a set amount, chances are it's not gonna come to that exact number. What's the mechanism for if it's over or under?
So there's a, again, I think Julia could speak to this more eloquently, but there are all kinds of reconciliations through either the Budget Adjustment Act or just the budget every year. The payouts, I believe, are going to school districts either monthly or quarterly. So they are going to know at a certain point whether they're over or under or right on track. But that happens all the time with appropriations you all make, and folks with more aptitude for math than me are in charge of that. So great question for Julia.
Okay, any other questions? And this is the only, at least in the Senate, the only amendment that
Correct.
was offered or voted on.
Correct.
Yeah, okay. All right. Well, why don't we, thank you, Beth. Why don't we have Julia come up, who heard the questions, I think, and may have other, did you have a presentation, Julia, or
I
didn't ask you to bring one, I don't think so.
The record, I'm Julie Richter with the Joint Fiscal Office. I don't have anything prepared. There is an updated fiscal note, but it's not going to look too different to what I presented to you, as overall the estimate hasn't changed from when it crossed over from the House to the Senate. So from a fiscal perspective, it's still 29 million being appropriated out of the ed fund. This is really just saying, instead of carrying it in the budget, as the bill was doing, and making a special nutrition section, this is putting that appropriation back into the bill itself. And I did take notes of a couple of questions. I don't know if you want me to dive into that, or if you want me.
Yeah, no, why don't you do that?
Okay, sure.
Yeah.
So the first question, I'm just going in order of how the questions. Actually, I think I'm going to go in order if it's okay of what would make the most sense. So just Beth spoke to it perfectly. The funding of the education fund comes from a variety of sources. We've got our non-property revenue sources, which is like sales and use, meals and rooms, purchase and use. And then the remainder is made up through property taxes. So to get at your question, Representative Lipsky, I believe your question was about, or there was a question if this is being funded with property taxes. So you may recall, the way that the education fund is structured is there are these certain revenue streams that I just spoke to, that there's a certain rate attached to them. So we've got our sales and use tax rate, we've got X number of dollars that are going to come into the education fund from sales and use and all of these other non-property revenue sources. And then because the education fund is a little bit different than our other state funds, we look at what are the total expenditures, and based on what the difference is between the total expenditures and what's being made up with non-property revenue sources, the remaining gap is what our property taxes are calculated to fill. So the higher the expenditure, if those non-property revenue sources stay the same, the higher the expenditures, the larger the gap that property taxes need to make up. So while this bill does not, the bill does not say that it will be funded through property taxes, but thinking through the mechanics of the education fund, if you don't have another revenue stream that is added into the education fund or a current non-property revenue stream that's not being adjusted, what is being adjusted to make up for that expenditure are the property taxes. And that's the same with, we saw an 8% increase in school budgets on average this year. So it's the same with any additional expenditure to the ed fund. 29 million is about 3 cents on both the homestead and non-homestead property tax rate. There any other questions about that before going into the other questions I heard?
Representative O'Brien?
So following up on Representative Lipsky's question, if you took the last 3 years or 5 years, do you know how much property tax contributed to the ed fund?
Yeah, so property tax is about 66%, about 2/3 of the education fund. So that's a ballpark figure. Of course, we've seen, really big changes over the past years with COVID, and there have been structural changes to the way that the education fund is funded over the past 5-10 years. There used to be a general fund transfer. Now it's its own sort of self-balancing fund. So there have been changes, but it is about 2/3.
Representative Rice?
So the fiscal note says that funding universal school meals through property taxes would result in an approximate 3-cent increase. Is that taking into account the fact that it's 66%? In other words, like is it 3 cent represent 66% of the costs of funding universal school meals? Or is that saying fully, the $29 million in property taxes is 3 cents?
I think it's difficult to interpret it in that way because of the way that the education fund is set up. Is we have these revenue streams that are kind of givens, and then whatever else is on top of those givens. So that's talking about compared to baseline or all else equal. If we didn't have universal school meals, then the estimated expenditures of the education fund would be $29 million fewer.
But not 100% of the education fund is paid for by property taxes. So to say that it's an increase of 3 cents across the board in property taxes, it's just, I understand that there's perhaps no better way to estimate it, but I think it's also important to understand that it probably doesn't actually look like 3 cents on property tax bills.
Respectfully, I would say that $10 million in expenditures in the education fund results in a 1 cent increase on the property taxes. So that's a ballpark figure. But when we look at $29 million, that's about 3 cents on both of the tax rates. So those tax rates need to be increased to raise the revenues, or else we'll see a shortfall in the education.
And then also just noted that between the two fiscal notes, the 29 million stays the same, but the projected range decreases, right? The low number goes down to 20 million.
Yeah, so the projected range changes. So that is, I'm sorry, I should have pulled up both fiscal notes. Thank you.
Welcome.
Yeah, so this is the fiscal note as passed the Senate, which has expanded the range from 20 to 31 million. And that incorporates the fact, as I'm sure the committee is aware, there's that proposed USDA rule change that would change the eligibility for the community eligibility provision. And so if that comes into play, then we're estimating that the cost of universal school meals could be lower. So that's why it's been decreased down to 20 on the lower end of things. And then on the higher end of things, it's assuming that those provisions that are hopefully going to draw down more federal funds don't go through for whatever reason or don't shake out the way that people are talking about.
We were first working on the bill and AOE came in, they had some early data on the uptake of the program this year, participation rates, and then we haven't heard back from them since then, obviously, but I wonder if you have, and whether assume that the fiscal note now and that range takes into account the latest and greatest information on what's actually happening. Just out of curiosity, do you have any?
I haven't seen updated participation figures, and fortunately Rosie is on a much well-deserved holiday at the moment. So I haven't seen the latest participation figures. I will say that the 29 million that we're estimating accounts for a slight uptick in participation, given the fact that there are a number of factors that we saw that were driving down participation rates. So thinking, okay, if some of those participation rates, some of those things that are driving down participation rates are accounted for, I see more kids eating meals in school, which results in an increased cost. But I don't have latest data on that for you today.
Representative O'Brien?
Just a process question, Julia. Who has authority to change the percentages? So if you took rooms and meals, like a certain percentage goes to the ed fund. So if you wanted to say instead of a quarter, a half, is it the legislature?
You all.
And so that's all in statute?
Yes, that's all a policy decision. So that's why we say, the property taxes is currently that flexible lever in the education fund. So that's why we get back to that 3-cent increase, because there has been no other change in funding streams. If there were to be another change in a funding stream into the education fund, then that additional cost wouldn't need to be all picked up by property taxes. So that's totally a policy choice.
Yeah.
Representative Lipsky?
Julia, you brought up the congressional farm bill or ag bill, about 5 minutes ago, that may increase the eligibility thresholds. So therefore, you lowered the range from 30 million down to 31 million to 20 million. Do you have any crystal ball what year that may get enacted, or when is it?
2025.
2025, so doesn't affect this
So that's
year.
why we're not seeing a decrease in the estimate for this year. And that's all of our estimates are in, I work very, very closely with Rosie. So they're all in consensus with AOE. And so I've spoken to Rosie a lot about this, and it's not, from her perspective, and she's really in the weeds on this, thinking it's going to go into effect, it does, in FY 2025, which is why we still aren't seeing that change in cost for the upcoming fiscal year.
Representative Cole?
I definitely want to check with Honora on this too, but so that change won't happen until 2025. Isn't the Medicaid eligibility criterion happening in 2024?
Yeah, so that's happening July 1st in 2024, this summer. So if the estimates are hold true, then we're going to see an increase in the number of students who are eligible for free and reduced price meals. And that is included in the estimate. So we saw in October of 2022 that about 34.85% were eligible for free and reduced price meals. And in 2019, we saw that it was 38.23%. So we don't think that there was just a big drop and that there's a lot of kids who are no longer eligible for free and reduced price meals. So we're thinking, okay, maybe that's a good baseline to think about what it's going to look like.
Representative Graham?
Is there any indication that the other funding sources are gonna stay stable next year? Or?
So so there's a state economist who publishes the forecast, and he has talked about, potential, lower revenues in the future as we sort of come out of this COVID spending era, but that's more in his bailiwick than it is in mine. All of our estimates into the ed fund and what it will look like in the coming years use those forecasted projections for the coming fiscal year. So him and his team estimate, X number of dollars are going to be coming into the ed fund from sales and use, and that's what we use to figure out what needs to be raised.
So if those other revenue funds come down, then the property taxes are going to go up more, right?
Yeah, so if expenditures stay the same, then the lower those non-property revenue sources are, the higher the property taxes need to be raised. And that does get to another question that was posed by the committee of what happens if it's over or under. So what if, you appropriate 29 million and it's 20 million, or it's 40 million, what happens? So if it's over, the cost is higher than those funds appropriated, and those funds need to be appropriated to the agency so that they can reimburse schools. So that would probably be done in the Budget Adjustment Act. It's under, so you're appropriating 29 million and it comes in to be below that amount, then the way that works is those dollars have been appropriated to the Agency of Education for a specific purpose. So if they can't spend those funds because the cost isn't as high, then it's called reversions. So those dollars are then reverted back to the education fund and are kind of like you can think of them as a revenue. Their dollars coming back to the ed fund to then be appropriated again by you all. Or they can hold those dollars in the agency if they're expecting that they would need them in the following year.
So if it goes over, then we just do the Budget Adjustment Act. That won't be property tax money, right?
That will be a policy question of
Can't raise property taxes in the middle
right. So it could be
of added on next year.
it could be an additional liability in the education fund next year, or there could be another funding stream that would solely be in the General Assembly's discretion to decide what to do.
Representative Levitt?
Can you just answer for me? I've read, and I just want to know if it's true or not, that there's a $65 million surplus in the Agency of Education budget. If yes, can we pull from that?
So I'm not sure. I don't know the 65 million surplus that you're talking about in the agency's budget.
Okay.
There's a couple of things I'll just speak to generally in hopes to answer your question. One is if that are funds that have been appropriated to the Agency of Education and they haven't spent, they've been appropriated for a specific purpose.
Right.
So those dollars would then need to revert back to the fund that they have been appropriated out of for the General Assembly to decide how to reallocate those funds. There is a question, there has been a conversation of a surplus in the education fund. In part, that's true. There are about $100 million that are unreserved, unallocated in the education fund. Even if all of those dollars were to be put towards lowering property tax rates, we would still see an average bill increase. So yes, there are unreserved, unallocated dollars, and property tax bills are going to be increasing on average in the coming year. And because the education fund is kind of like one big working expenditures affect the revenues, you could, if you were to, there's no specific way to direct.
Got it. Right.
It's
Okay.
all like a big pot, You say, okay, here's all the expenditures, here's what the revenues have raised thus far, and then here's the remaining that we need to raise.
Got it. Okay. Thank you.
So just to give us some context, the following question, 29 million is essentially what percent of the education fund?
I think it's less than 2.
2
billion something is the ed fund.
It's less than various cities' budget.
school budget.
Yeah, so just to give
Like how big is the education?
a sense, so the total uses in fiscal year '24 in the education fund are expected to be about $2.1 billion.
Thank you, Counselor.
29 million as categorical aid sort of falls. The highest categorical aid in the education fund is special education at 226 million. And the lowest categorical aid is small school support at 8.3 million. That helps provide some context.
What's busing?
Sorry?
What's busing, transportation?
Transportation aid is 23.5 million.
Julia, I don't have the latest fiscal note up in front of me for those of us, for others who might not. And I'm not sure if it's spelled out there, but the range that JFO now is projecting sounds like it goes from 20 to 31.
Correct.
Yep. And is the 29 million, I'm just wondering, because it's the same number that the bill started out with, and it's maybe the same number we had in last year. Is that JFO's best guess? It doesn't fall in the middle of the range. And I'm just curious to know whether it's coincidence that it's the same number we've been hearing all along, or whether your range is skewed somehow so that it seems like, 29 would be the best guess.
I would say it's the best estimate. Yeah. We reached the 29 million last year with the data that we had available at the time. We had less data available, and it came to be pretty similar to, it's looking to be pretty similar to that estimate. And then our modeling this year used the updated data, and we still are reaching the 29 million. That's assuming, a 5% increase in participation and an increase. So that's increasing the estimated cost. And we're assuming an increase in the number of students who are free and reduced eligible, which is decreasing the cost. And we've got all these factors at play, that these proposed rule changes and policy changes. And
so as we've been talking about how the education fund works and the other sources beside property taxes, and hearing about sales taxes and meals and rooms taxes that contribute, the forecast for those numbers, the latest forecast was in December or January sometime. Yeah. So for the months since then, have we been tracking close to the forecast for those?
we've been coming in a little under.
A little under. Yeah.
In terms of our revenue forecast, but it's hard to know how the coffers are going to shake out until the close of the fiscal year, because we have, late filers and refunds and processing time. So
I wasn't thinking about income necessarily, but maybe there are late filers for sales tax as well. I was thinking specifically about the sales tax.
Sales tax, I could, 1 second. So the latest, looking at, this is in April, we're looking at about $1 million below forecast for the year. So relatively on track, a little bit under, but we still have months to go. So
I mean, $1 million is $1 million, but it's as a percentage pretty close, I imagine.
Yes.
Okay. Representative O'Brien.
Just one more quick context question. What's this universal school meals cost as a program? It's like 29 million is for Vermont's contribution, but do we know what the federal government's is, or the whole?
I do not have that number in front of me. Sorry.
Like, do we know what percentage the 29 million is?
I haven't done that work.
I just wondered it.
Yeah.
The only other thought I had was, and you may have to go, Julia, to another, are you?
My next testimony was actually pushed back a little bit.
Okay.
So
Well,
I'm happy to support the committee.
Just very, very quickly, and don't want to get us off on a tangent, but we're also voting tomorrow, I think, on the yield bill.
Mm-hmm.
That is tied into the conversation we're having, because it's a number that, or there's a couple of numbers there, but it includes not the tax rates exactly, but it's derived from the same data that you're talking about, really, that helps us come up with what the cost is going to be here.
Yeah.
And that's also, so that's a decision, that's a policy decision we make and I think they have built in the cost of this program in arriving at that number. So the self-balancing piece here is at play in the next bill that we're taking up, I think, on the calendar right after this bill.
Yeah, and that's an excellent point, and I really encourage anyone who's interested in the Ed Fund to check out the Ed Fund Outlook, because you can see all of the different policy pieces that are affecting the education fund and how the yields are filling up the education fund. I can also sit down with folks, but yes, the yields, which are the number that sets the tax rates, and the tax rates have been adjusted so that universal meals is fully funded.
All right, well, thank you very much, Julia, and we'll reach out directly if anyone does have other questions.
Please.
Yeah. Now, why don't we have Honor Horton come up to the table if you'd like. And maybe there was a question or two that you heard asked that we didn't get an answer to that you might help with. I don't know.
Yes, I tried to take notes. For the record, Honor Horton, Executive Director of Hunger Free Vermont. Hello, I haven't been here with you all for quite some time.
Thank you.
It's nice to be back. Thank you for having me. Would you like me to begin with addressing a couple of those?
I think so, yeah. And if there's anything else that you think might be useful for us to just have, I would say anything that's changed since the last time you spoke to us, that might be the other information that you could provide.
Right. Well, perhaps let me just begin with the biggest frame, the biggest picture here, which is that this committee, which is where H-165 originated way back in the beginning of this session, you crafted a really excellent bill. And the policy that you worked very hard on and the amendments that you made in this committee to the bill as originally introduced have stood the test of many committees in both the House and the Senate unchanged from the work that you did. So that is a testament to your care and attention and thoughtfulness and commitment to making this policy the best that it could be. So I really, really thank you for that. And it's really important that you understand that the only change that you're talking about today is that the same amount of money that has been JFO's estimate from the beginning just got moved from the budget back into this bill. It was in the bill, actually, at the beginning. I think Ways and Means took it out, or the appropriations took it out, House appropriations took it out. I'm not sure. But anyway.
We took it out.
You took it out. Oh, you took it out. All right. Well, you took it out. So there you go. But it's the same 29 million, and it's just back in the bill. And that's the only change. No policy has been changed in this bill. So, so this is the bill that you created, you designed, and Hunger Free Vermont and the Coalition for Universal School Meals does ask for your concurrence in this Senate amended version that is coming back to you. All right, so let's see. So one question is 29 million of state funding for the Universal School Meals Supplement brings us how many federal dollars to fund the Universal School Meals program overall in Vermont. So our best estimate is that the 29 million in state funding will draw down 35 million in federal funding every year and that funding goes through our Agency of Education to our school districts and intersects with the local food purchasing incentive and our farm to school grant funding, right? The original vision of Farm Fresh School Meals for All are those three pieces. And that funding flows, in part to our local agricultural producers and to our farm to school programs and to pay for school nutrition program staff to make the meals and to feed all students in all public schools and participating independent schools as well. So that's our estimate of the breakdown of federal to state funding. Now, that estimate is based on what's happening right now, but those two changes that you all were just speaking about with JFO, the direct certification through Medicaid, which is happening. So there's no question that change has happened. Vermont has been approved by USDA to directly certify students for free and reduced price school meals using Medicaid data. And that will start for the coming school year. So that is one thing that both the Agency of Education and Joint Fiscal Office, and Hunger Free Vermont agrees with them, is likely to lower the cost of the program. But it hasn't happened. Those actual numbers have not been run yet. So the $29 million estimate is staying in place for now. The second change that you were speaking about, Representative Lipsky, so it's not in the Farm Bill. It's actually a rule change that USDA is proposing. So it's in USDA's power to make as an administrative change. It does not require congressional action. And that is to change the eligibility percentage, the percentage of directly certified students that a school must have in order to use the community eligibility provision to provide universal meals, from 40%, which is what it is now, to 25%. So that is a huge change. It's going to allow many, many, many more schools in Vermont and across the country to use the community eligibility provision. And that provision is, first of all, much simpler administratively for both school districts, for families, and for the Agency of Education. And it tends to return a higher federal reimbursement rate to schools. So both Medicaid Direct Cert and this change, the community eligibility provision, will increase the number of federal dollars and decrease the number of state dollars that need to be spent on Vermont's universal school meals program. That change, we will know if that rule change has gone through, I believe in July, but it won't fully take effect, as JFO was just telling you, for one more school year. So we have kind of two improvements in the federal reimbursement to look forward to, and one will happen this coming school year and the next will happen the following school year. There was a question about participation rates in school meals. So we also don't have any newer participation rate data than November. But that data showed that 40% of all students in Vermont schools that were using the Universal School Meals Supplement are eating breakfast this year, and 60% are eating lunch. And those numbers are the highest statewide percentages, participation percentages in breakfast and lunch that we've ever documented in the history of documenting school meal participation in Vermont. And that's not the whole story, because that's just looking at all students, treating all students at all income levels equally and looking at the total participation rates statewide. But if you break it down by student household income, low-income students, so the students who would have qualified for free and reduced price school meals if we were still using the old pricing program, they participated in breakfast in November at a 12% higher rate than students overall. And they participated in lunch at a 6% higher rate than students overall. So low-income students are using the Universal School Meals program at a significantly higher rate than higher income students, which indicates the need for this policy because it indicates the degree to which stigma was keeping low-income students from eating these meals. But it also shows you that we ought to expect that those differentials in participation rates are going to continue. And that also means higher federal reimbursement drawdown, right? And less state funds needing to be spent. So, and I think those were all of the questions that I noted that I can help you with.
Thank you. Representative O'Brien.
Just follow up on the last statistic. Other states that have universal school meals similar to ours, are the percentages about the same or do we do better first?
So I don't have a lot of information on that. And the one state that I have conferred with about this is Maine, and our participation rates are higher. However, it's also important to note that there is no Universal School Meals program in operation that is the same as ours right now. And I may be personally biased, but ours is the best because our state, Act 151, and this is the same policy will be recreated if H 165 passes. We're the only state that has required that every school must use one of the two federal provisions for universal school meals if they want to draw down any state funding. So every school in Vermont that uses the Universal School Meals program must maximize their federal reimbursement by using whatever federal provision, whether that's the community eligibility provision or provision 2, that will yield the best federal reimbursement rate for them. And one of the changes that you made that will make the policy even better going forward is that the Agency of Education, you have empowered the Agency of Education to assess and help schools assess over time ongoingly when it might be better for them to switch to a different program or run a new base year for their program in order to ongoingly, continuously make sure that every single school district is maximizing their federal reimbursement. So no other state required that. And that means that our Universal Meals program is both the most cost effective and may have the best student participation rates as well.
Is there anything else that you wanted to add? Not seeing any other hands up. Questions?
Well, again, I just want to thank you profoundly for your work on this bill. It's a really smart bill. The policy is working really well, and it's going to work even better next year, thanks to what you've done. So I request respectfully that you concur with the Senate version that has been sent over. And I thank you very, very much.
Representative Paul?
Nora, I'm wondering if you could also speak to how these two changes will impact the year-round allocation of food through summer programs and how those federal dollars are being leveraged by these two changes.
Yes, so both directly certifying students through Medicaid and the rule change that we expect on the community eligibility provision are going to increase the number of schools and towns that they serve that will be eligible to operate summer and after school meal programs for children. Now, these are two totally separate child nutrition programs from the school breakfast and lunch program. However, eligibility for after-school and summer meal programs is determined by school breakfast and lunch low-income student participation rates. So there's this complicated interaction that happens. But by passing H 165, the way that the community eligibility provision works with these summer and after school meal programs, we ran the numbers and we expect that we will more than double the number of schools and attendance areas, so towns that those schools are in, that are going to be able to run universal free after school and summer meal programs for all children ages 0 to 18. And that's all federally funded, 100% federally funded meal programs. And when you think about the expansion of after school that is also working its way through this building right now, that's going to be a really critical combination of things that's going to be really, really good. So we estimate that an additional $6 million in federal funding every year could be unlocked for Vermont to feed Vermont kids meals and snacks after school and over the summer because of H 165.
So just to follow up and put it in other language, which you said it really well too, but so because we're making this investment during the school year to pay a part of the portion of children's meals through the state and a portion of the meals through the federal government, schools are literally getting free meals throughout the summer by the federal government, zero contribution from the state.
Yes, that's accurate. Not every school, but many more will be eligible to serve students in that way and communities. And so, student hunger during the school day at school is a very real thing that this universal school meals will solve. But students are actually most vulnerable to hunger during after school and summer months. And so this is going to make a tremendous difference year round for not just school age kids, but all kids ages 0 to 18 can be served by these programs, whether they attend that particular school or not. So it will now be our job to make sure that all these schools and communities can be connected to these programs, and we can help to make sure that they are able to operate them. But this opens up a very exciting new opportunity for us to really eliminate child hunger in every county in our state. It's very exciting.
Representative O'Brien?
So in North, when I subbed at Cambridge, we would get backpacks ready with food for kids on the weekends. Is that part of this program? And going forward, would this be sort of, how do you get that? Would it be request, or is it need blind? Or if you're any family of any income, you can sign up for food in summer or after school?
So the backpack program is not a federal child nutrition program. It's a charitable food effort. And so that's totally separate from what I'm talking about. So I'm talking about full meals and snacks that are prepared that students can either, if it's summer, they can either pick them up or they get them as part of a program that they're in, or if it's after school, they get them at school as part of the after school offerings, or at like a Boys and Girls Club can run an after school meal program, for example, or a library can. So those are federally funded programs, what I'm talking about, and the backpack program is a separate thing.
Okay, but back to your summer and after school, how does one get enrolled in those? Are they essentially not connected anymore to the lower income? Are they universal?
So they're universal because the rules of those programs are just different. You have to hit a threshold of 50% low-income students. And then if you hit that threshold, you can operate the program and every student can receive, every child who shows up can receive a meal and you don't have to sign them up and you don't have to have them fill out an application or anything. They're just very different in the way they operate from school breakfast and lunch. And if you don't hit that 50% threshold, you just can't do the program at all. So it's just different rules that the feds have established for that program.
Representative Cole.
Yes, just to feed up of that too. So yes, it will disproportionately affect children who would qualify for the free and reduced without this program. So yes, it would be more serving that population, but anyone technically can participate, but because they need to meet that threshold, it's likely going to be the majority of those students who are qualifying. Yeah.
And to be clear, the appropriation in this bill doesn't really address those programs, but it is related. And I think it's a good point that there's potential savings to the state, or at least savings to Vermonters by drawing down federal funds, $6 million. It's a number I think I heard you say that otherwise.
Yes, this, what's the business term? There's an additional return on investment with this bill that is not in the policy of this bill, because this bill is focused on school breakfast and lunch, but it is going to have this really beneficial additional effect.
Great. Well, if there aren't any other questions or any other thoughts that you wanted to share, thank you for coming in.
Thank you.
We should take a vote. I described it as a straw poll earlier. I'm not sure that's right, technically. Representative Pearl will ask if you would go through the normal process, and I'll ask if anyone would like to move that we recommend concurring with the Senate proposal of amendment.
I'll make a motion, we concur with the Senate. Whatever.
Proposal of amendment.
Proposal of amendment, sorry, that got lost.
Thank you. And is there a second?
Second.
Okay, if there isn't any other discussion, you can go ahead and call the roll.
All right, Representative Esme Cole.
Yes.
Ooh, do I put this in the amendments section? Probably.
I think we're only taking one vote, so it's probably fine
Either way?
Yeah.
Yes. Representative Rodney Graham.
Yes.
Representative Josie Levitt.
Yes.
Representative Jed Lipsky.
Yes.
Representative John O'Brien.
Yes.
Representative Henry Pearl.
Yes.
Representative Mike Rice.
Yes.
Representative Heather Supernaut.
Yes.
Representative David Templeman.
Yes.
Representative Charles Wilson.
No.
Representative David Durfee.
Yes.
Vote tally is 10-1-0.
All right, that sounds right. Thank you, everybody. Is there any other business for this afternoon?
No.
Other than the floor.
Yeah, any other committee business?
No.